Hello and welcome to this first tutorial for the Infinite Runner engine. I'm Renaud and I just created this asset that I'm about to release on the asset store. Today what we're gonna try to do is get a grasp of what's in the engine and how you can use it to create your own game. To do that, what we're gonna do is first have a look at the minimal 2D scene. So this is what it looks like when you open the minimal scene. Um, Obviously right now it doesn't look like much, but if you press play, you'll see that you're able to play, well, a very basic endless runner game. Well, you jump over platforms, and if you fall, you lose a life, and you get to start again, and so on and so on. Of course, that's a basic level. The set includes something like 7 different levels that go from really basic to more advanced stuff, like this one, for example, where you get to play some sort of weird guy sitting on a backwards dragon for some reason. And this one has, particles and stuff. We'll get to that later on. So let's go back to the minimal 2D scene. And to start things off, I guess what we can do is have a look at what we have in the hierarchy menu. So, first of all, we have the instructions prefab. It's a very simple prefab that you just have to drop in your scene to display some information at the start of your game. So, if I press play again, you'll see that in action. That's what you see at the top of the game window, and it disappears after a while. Um, on the instructions prefab is an instruction script where you get to define the duration of the display of the instructions and the duration of the fade. We'll see later on where you define the text. So all you have to do is just drop that in the scene if that's something you're interested in. Then we have the UI camera, which is much more complex. The good thing is that you don't have to worry about it. The engine takes care of all that complexity for you. What you need to know though is that you shouldn't modify the prefab, just place it in the scene. That is until you want to change how it looks like. But if you're okay with how it looks, just leave it at that. It contains a lot of stuff. It contains everything you see on the GUI. That's the pause button, the name of the level, the score, the lives in the top right corner. But it also contains the mobile controls. That's what you see here. Right now they're disabled. That's because it's automatically activated during the game by the level manager, and we'll get back to that later on. But as you can see, it contains default controls that will cover most of your usage for simple games like Endless Runners. So you have left and right buttons. If you activate these, you'll see what it looks like. So that's our UI camera. And if we go back to here, and if we set the alpha of this to 1, you see that the left button is actually pretty big and covers, well, the left part of the screen. So if you're on mobile and you click on the left part, you activate the left button. And how that works is that this button has a touch zone script. That's something created specially for the Infinite Runner engine. And how it works is that you select what happens when the user presses this button, and in this case it activates the left action, but it could be the main action or the pause or anything you want. And of course you can add your own ones. You can define if something happens when the user presses this zone down or up, or even if something happens when the left button is being pressed down. Of course, we're just gonna set this back as it was so we don't break stuff. And so you have this left and right buttons, the main action button, which covers the whole screen. That's if you have a simple one button game. There's the pause screen, which is displayed when you press pause. So we'll see how it looks like. If I press pause, that's the escape key. Or you can just also like just simply click in the top left corner, or even touch if you're on a touch device. So this pause screen, my bad. This pause screen, what's in it? You'll see that we have three buttons, and these buttons are also controlled. Well, you can just simply click on them, but you can also move up and down with your arrow keys, or maybe up and down with your gamepad if you have one. And the order of these buttons and how they are linked with each other works with this script that is on the pause screen prefab. It has a button list where you just drag and drop, all the buttons. You have to set a size for that. Then you can define the keyboard speed. That's if you press, for example, the bottom arrow, the down arrow, and you keep pressing it. That's how fast it's gonna repeat the input. You can also define the axis. Maybe you want your buttons to move up and down, but maybe left and right. That's something you're also gonna find on the level selection scene. So I'm just gonna not save that. And yeah, the level selection scene is just basically a list of buttons with some tricks in it. I won't go into details. If you're interested, you can just have a look at the script. But that's how you go from one level to the other using the arrow keys. You can, of course, simply select a button. Everything is thought in this engine to work with keys, well, keyboard or gamepad, uh, as well as with the mouse or touch controls on mobile. But let's go back to the minimal 2D scene. What else do we have? We have a ground. I'll go into details on how it works later on, but just we have a ground. That's good to know. We also have a parallax background. That's something that's quite useful, especially if you have an endless runner game. That's something you're gonna want. This one is quite ugly, but that's a demo level. Let's see how it works. If you look at the background, you'll see that it moves slightly slower than the platforms, and it's kind of hard to see on that one, but there are some different levels of background, and let's see if I can show you. As you can see, we have like these little dots on one level, and then we have these big red lines, and then we have some sort of small squares. All of these work with a simple, really simple script called parallax. You just have to add that to a sprite and define a speed. That speed will be relative to the current level speed. So this one has a speed of 5, 7, and 1. And basically that's all you need. I put them all into some big prefab, but you can do it however you want. Just note that there's also a different script. I think I can show it to you in this scene. Yep. It's basically the same thing, but it works with textures. So the difference is that if you look at how the scene goes once I play it, you'll see that it's just the prefabs are not moving, it's actually just offsetting the texture. That's one solution, and if you look at how it works in the minimal 2D scene, you'll see that it's actually the same on this scene, but Let's find another example. Maybe this one. Nope. Uh, yeah, let's see the lane runner. The lane runner one. It's in 3D, but yeah, you'll see what I mean. This one also has parallax background, so it's in 3D, but it's the same thing. And as you can see, maybe the whole background is duplicated. And what happens? You see, this one goes there, and when it reaches a certain zone, it just gets cloned back to its original position, um, giving the impression to the player that it's actually infinite. So you have these two parallax solutions. I suggest you give both of them a try, and depending on the performance and your own needs, you decide on one or the other. So next in the hierarchy list, we have the managers. The level is and must contain a game manager, an input manager, and a level manager. The game manager is supposed to handle all the complete game logic. He is responsible for registering and storing the playable characters, the lives, and the speed of the level. It's really global, and you shouldn't worry too much about it because you won't really interact with it. What you will interact with is the level manager. But before that, just know that you need an input manager. That's a class that is responsible for all the input, obviously. So let's open it in MonoDevelop, and we'll see what it does. It's quite a long class. Don't worry too much about it. It just works. But it's good to know where the things are if you're looking to change them. So what it does is at update, it calls a method called handle keyboard, which will look for actions on the keyboard. So for example, maybe you've pressed the pause button down, or maybe you've just released the right button. And if something like that happens, it just calls a method. So for example, it can call, if you press the main action button down, it will call this method that will send a message to the game manager if some conditions are met, and that will trigger the main action start for each playable character. So just know that you need to have an input manager, and the engine won't work without that. Then moving on, we have the level manager, which is kind of the core of the engine. You'll see that it has quite a lot of stuff in the inspector. There's first of all the starting position, so that's another game object that's on the scene. As you can see, it's materialized by a small gray label and label, and so that's where we instantiate your characters when you press play. So let's see. You see the small the small square just fell from its starting position. You can of course change this position however you want. So let's put it up there. If we press play again, we see that that little cube just fell from higher on. Then we have the list of playable characters. Right now we only have one because we want only one jumper cube in our scene, but if you look at maybe the multiple characters to the scene, you'll see that you can have more than one. Right now we have three that move independently You see, I can even maybe lose one and keep playing with the remaining two, and yeah, I've lost. Um, because I'm pretty bad at my own games. But back to our level manager. So that's where you drag and drop your playable characters. Um, you can set the distance between the characters if you have more than one. You can define the points per second. So if we press play, you will see that every time the game is running, we increment the score. Um, and right now we're giving 20 points per second, but we could be giving maybe 99,999 points per second, and let's see how it goes. As you can see, I'm gaining points much faster than before, so that's something you can change. Of course, you can put it to 0 if you want points to be gained by different means. Maybe you're just picking coins or stars or something. Then we have the instruction text. If you remember at the start of this video, we went over the instructions prefab. So you just, if you want instructions in your game, you just drop that prefab, and then into the level manager inspector, you just type stuff that will populate the instructions panel. Moving on, we have the recycle line. That's something that's really important in terms of performance. I'll go over that later on. Then you have the speed. That's the speed of your level. It can change over time. Maybe you want that the longer the player plays, the harder the level gets, and that's you can do that by making your level faster. So you'll see that this speed affects all the objects, all the moving objects that are in your scene. So you can set its initial speed. Right now it's 10, it's fairly low. If I put it to 50 and change the maximum speed to 100 and change the acceleration, that's how fast you gain speed to 3. You'll see that I'm probably gonna lose any minute. Yeah, it's way too fast for me, but yeah, depending on the size of your platforms and your game style, it can be a good idea to change these values. Let's put it back to something like that. Of course, you can have a fixed speed, and in that case, you just put the same value in both inputs. Then we have the intro and outro durations. That, if you notice right at the start, you have a fade from black to nothing. And you can increase the duration of these fades. For example, if I put 5, you'll see that the fade is much slower. I like it at 1, but you know, change that if you want. Then we have a start countdown. For example, we can say we want to wait 2 seconds and then say hello people for some reason. And if we press play, you'll see that I'm not able to, yeah, actually I can move, but you can define that somewhere else. But we have a countdown now, so that's something. But I don't want a countdown because for demo purposes it's not really convenient. Then you can define the mobile control scheme. Earlier on we saw that the UI camera already contains a bunch of different settings of different button layouts. That's why you change it. Right now I want a single button because anywhere I press on the screen I want my character to jump, but I could choose to have a left-right scheme, and then I would have to modify how my character controls. And then you have the effect that happens when you lose a life. That's completely optional, of course, but if you have a look at that, let's try to lose, you'll see that bam, there's an explosion. That's where you set it. Alright, moving on, we have the platform spawner. I'm gonna go over that in details in just a minute. The starting position, we've already seen that one. And we have the main camera. Um, the main camera has different stuff in it. First of all, we have the minimum zoom and maximum zoom. These are linked to your level speed. The idea is that maybe at the start of your level you'll want some really close-up zoom, and as the player gains speed and the level gains speed, maybe you'll want to zoom out, and that's where you set it. You have two choices. You can either change these values like you would in a classic inspector, or maybe you can also move the camera around, and so you can preview how it looks like. And when you're okay with the new settings, maybe you want to change for example the size of the camera. Let's put it at 10, and yeah, change its position. When you're good to go, you just click on this button, and as you can see, it just affects um, the different settings. So that's a way to easily position your start and end zoom values. Then you can define if the camera is supposed to follow the player on the different axes, and the camera speed. That's the speed the camera will try to follow the player at. And then we have the bounds. The bounds are materialized in the scene with this blue box. The idea is that wherever your character goes, your camera is constrained by these bounds. So if you don't want your camera to move, you can set it like that, basically in a prison box. But you can also decide that you want your camera to be able to move much more, and by changing these values, you can easily define and see what you're doing. I'll just set it back to how it was. And that covers most of the basic essential prefabs you need in your scene. So now let's see how things move and how you can actually create a game. If we start a game, you'll see that, well, now you can't because it's dead, but you may have seen that the player is not actually moving. The idea is that the whole world moves, your player remains at the same position. The reason behind that is that if the player was moving, actually moving in terms of coordinates in a 3D space, at some point the player would reach something like billions, an X value of billions, and then we would have memory problems. An alternative to that would be to reset the scene to its original position every once in a while, but I tried that and didn't get really good results in terms of performance. So I think that this is the easiest setup for you. It allows you to always have in the scene view a good idea of what's happening. Right now we see just platforms because our player is dead, but I think it's much easier in this way to control what happens in your game, and for the player it's exactly the same. There's no difference in terms of experience. So how does it work? Let's just stop that. So let's take the basic ground platform. That's the one we put at the start. That's actually the only one that we have in our scene, because that's the one we want to instantiate before the spawn platforms appear. That's your start platform, basically. So what it has is it has a box collider and a rigid body to allow for collision detection. It has a pullable object script and an out of bounds recycle script. The out of bounds recycle script is responsible for recycling objects. I'll go into details about all that later on. And then we have, and that's where the magic happens, we have a moving object script right at the bottom. And this script is responsible for making your platform move depending on the speed of the level. You can see the details of that in the class. What it does is at fixed update, it just translates the object depending, as you can see, on the speed of the level, the fixed delta time, and the speed divided by 10. So that's where it happens. You can also have that object accelerate. So for example, if I give it only a speed of 1 but an acceleration of 5, and if I press play, I'm not sure it's going to be easy to see because it's basically just an orange box, but maybe you've just been able to see that it starts really slow and then it accelerates. Let's put it back. And of course, if I put a speed of 0, the object will be there forever. As you can see, it's not moving. It's like magic. And then we have the platform spawner. That's the spawners, because there are actually a bunch of them, are probably going to be at the core of your game. In most endless runner games, you'll have platforms coming at you, you'll have enemies coming at you, bonuses coming at you, and that's the core of the gameplay. So for that, I've included in the asset a bunch of ways that you can spawn stuff. I've started with two different ways, two different generic ways. One is based on the distance, and one is based on time. So right now I'm going to show you the most complex one, which is the distance based spawner. But know that there's also a timed spawner. I'm not exactly sure if I've included one in the demo files, but it's much more simple, and what it does is at specified intervals, and you can even have a random value, it will spawn stuff. But it's basically the same idea. If you understand the distance one, you'll have no problem with the time one. So what do we have? The distance spawner and all spawners actually are linked to object pools. If you're not familiar with the concept, an object pool is basically like a big reservoir for objects. Instead of instantiating a new object every time you need one, let's say you want to spawn a new platform every second, at the end of 1 minute you would have spawned and instantiated 60 platforms. That's a lot to handle for example, a mobile device. So what you want to do instead is at the start of the game instantiate maybe 10 platforms and reuse them, because most of the time you will only have one or two on screen. So to show you how it works and to show it in action, let's just press play and go to the scene view. If I zoom out, you'll see that most of the time we only have like 2 or 3 platforms on screen, and you can see they are spawned over there and they just magically disappear over there. They're not, going away forever. And if we go back to our hierarchy view, you'll see that we have a new object, which has been instantiated by code, and that's this simple object pooler. As you can see, I've provisioned something like, 20 objects, and most of the time only 2, 3, maybe 4 are active at a time. So obviously right now I've been a bit on the safe side. I could have only provisioned something like 5. Let's just change that. Um, the idea is that if you only provision for what you really need, of course, performance will be better. So let's put 5. As we've seen that it never happens. We never need more than 5. Um, and right now, you see we have only 5 objects, and as you can see, 2 of them remain inactive. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The other thing to know is that on the object poolers, you also have an option that you can check or not, which is that the pool can expand. So let's say you've provisioned only 5 objects in your pool, and the spawner spawns more than you had expected. If you've checked that option, the pool will expand and provision for more. Of course, be careful with that, because if you check that option and I don't know, maybe forget to put the recycle line in the scene, you will spawn an infinite number of objects over time. So yeah, the recycle line, it's something that's here. As you can see, I've even included some nice visual things so you can see what happens. The idea is that that's the exposition that will define when your objects are getting recycled. So for example, if I move that over there, you see that it doesn't change, because that's completely normal. That's because that's registered at the start of the level. But if we move it over there and then press play, you'll see that our platforms stay alive much longer until they reach the line. So yeah, you cannot move it at runtime, but who would want to do that? Let's put it back where it came from, over there. All right. The same idea goes for these death lines. You have one here and one here. The idea is that if the player crosses these lines, he's dead, and you've lost a life, or you've lost a game if you don't have any life left. So back to our spawner, if I manage to select it. So yeah, you need an object pool on your spawner, and that's where the spawner will pick the objects from. And then you have all these settings. You can define the size of your object. So right now, the pool is filled with ground objects. So ground object is a prefab that you will find somewhere, probably here. So that's, if I drag it, that's a ground object. That's this sort of big platform. And I can change its size, I can change its minimum and maximum size. That's something that's going to be picked at random. So let's say I want really small platforms. I will just do something like that. And if I press play, you'll see that the new platforms that are spawned are extremely small, and the game is going to be very hard. On the other hand, I can also decide that I want extremely big platforms. So I put random values like that. And now I have extremely big platforms, and it's gonna be hard to. If I just reset the values. Alright. I can also change the Z value, but it only works in 3D. So you'll have examples of that in the minimal 3D scene. That's something I haven't mentioned until yet, but the engine handles both 2D and 3D. So you can do anything in these two modes. All you have to do is on your different objects, you're gonna need, well, we'll see that when we go to characters actually, but yeah. Let's go back to our spawner. Yeah, the spawner. So you can change also the rotation. So right now all the platforms that are spawned in this level are not rotated. But in the same way, you can change the size. You can select minimum and maximum values. So let's go completely crazy on that one. So I've put a minimum value of -40 and a maximum value of 40 on all axes. So if I press play, you'll see that I now have platforms that are completely wild. And if we go to the scene and go into 3D mode, you'll see that they are rotated randomly on all axes. Obviously, we'll go back to 0 because otherwise I just keep losing. Then we have the minimal and maximum Y clamp values. That's how the engine will make sure that whatever the values you've put in the minimum and maximum size and the gaps, we'll come to that, will make sure that the platforms are spawned between these two blue lines. And yeah, the engine even draws this line for you on the scene mode in real time, so you can check that it works with maybe your starting position, your background, and stuff like that. Then you can also check this box to decide that the platforms are only spawned while the game is in progress. The game can have various status, and you can have a look at that if you select the game manager and press play. If you look in the inspector, you'll see that right now the game has a status of game in progress, but if I manage to lose, I'm now in the life lost state, and if I press play again, I'm back to game in progress. There are like something like 4 or 5 possible status. There's before game start. That's if you have a countdown, for example. There's game in progress. There's life lost, and there's game over. These are game events handled by the game event or event manager class, event manager. And you can of course add some more. The idea behind these events is that any class can register to them and do something when some of these events are triggered. Back to our spawner. I apologize if this goes in all directions. I haven't rehearsed this tutorial, but I'm sure you'll manage to come up with something after watching it. So we've seen this checkbox, the gap between objects. So that's the distance, minimum and maximum distance that you can have between an object. For all of these, of course, if you put the same value in the minimum and maximum size, there's no random element anymore, and it will just apply, for example, a gap of 2. If I put 2 here and there, the x gap between two platforms will always be 2, and we can check that. As you can see, we now have very regular gaps, and if I put a minimum gap value of 1, for example, and a maximum value of, let's say, 30, I will now have a big chance of falling down forever. As you can see, the platforms are much more spaced, and at some point I should have a gap of 30, yeah, and I've lost. Same goes for the y and z values. Let's say I have a gap, a y gap of 0. All my platforms are now gonna spawn in the same line, making for a pretty boring game. But uh, why not? Or you can double jump too. You can actually set the number of jumps. And there's also the spawn distance from player. That's something that you can also tweak, and that's the initial point. It's dependent on the distance to the player, and that's about it for the spawners. Um, One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that you have simple object pools, but in some scenes you may want to spawn from the same point, you may want to spawn different objects. Maybe you have different platforms, just maybe just the look of them change, but you want them to spawn randomly. So there's an example of that in the backwards dragon scene. For example, the tree spawner. So if I press play just to show you, you'll see that there are trees in the background. They are also created using spawners like the ones we've just seen. And this spawner also is a distance spawner, but it's plugged to a multiple object pooler. It's the same thing as the one we've seen before, but you can, instead of choosing only one object, you can have any number of objects. So this one has 24 objects in it, and as you can see, there's random variations of trees. You can see what it looks like if you go to resources, decoration. You see I have various trees in there, and so you decide for each you put all your game objects there, so you define a size. It opens all these little boxes. You drag and drop all your trees. You'll have a fun time doing that. It's really boring, but it works. And then you can also decide the size for each element, how many objects you want to provision, and you can also have that pool expand. That's something that to keep in mind if for some reason in your game you want to have various objects spawn at the same point. So now that we've seen basically the core of the asset, we've seen how to spawn stuff, we've seen how things move. The main thing we haven't seen is probably the most important one, is the player. If we go back to the minimal 2D scene, you'll see that when I press play, a player is instantiated by the level manager. That's where we've said I want that little cube to be my hero, my player. And when I press stuff, I've actually got a moving player. So if I go to my resources and go to minimal 2D, here I have an example of a playable character. What is a playable character in the Infinite Runner engine? It's a prefab that has the player tag. Most of the time you want it to have a box collider. It can be a 2D or 3D box collider. Actually, let's move to the 3D scene for this example. So it's almost the same thing as the 2D one, but yeah, you guessed it, it's in 3D. So now it's not just a square, it's a cube, and I'm jumping on 3D platforms, and there's shadows and stuff. As you can see, I'm much better at illustration than 3D modeling, so I'm really sorry, but the demo levels in 3D are really basic. So if I go to my minimal 3D folder here, I have my 3D player. So now it's just a box collider, not a box collider 2D. Note that the asset works with 2D and 3D. I might have mentioned that earlier. Um, how it works is that it has this rigid body interface script. I've put that there so you can use all classes. You can have the moving object class, the enemy damage class, etc., without having to choose between the 2D version of the class and the 3D version of the class. This interface handles everything and makes sure that it it just works, so you don't have to worry about it. Of course, if you're worried about performance and if you want to get rid of some of these checks, you may want to get rid of that and modify some classes so they access directly the 3D or 2D value. But if you're as long as you don't see any change in performance, just stick to that. Will be easier for future updates and so on. So you have that interface that will just handle the 2D, 3D compatibility stuff. And then we have a jumper script. This jumper script is just an example of a playable character, but you could imagine a gameplay where you're not actually jumping. I've included an example where you just run and change lanes, but maybe you want to shoot instead of jump. Maybe you want to, I don't know, dive or have something happen, teleport, whatever you want. So let's have a look at that jumper script. As you can see, there are a few things in it. Let's open it. As we open it, the first thing we see is that jumper is actually an extension of the playable character class, and that's gonna be the base, the absolute base of any of your playable character scripts if you want to extend them. Of course, you can just reuse the jumper script, or you can reuse the Flappy one, which mimics, of course, Flappy Bird. But if you want to create a new one, and I encourage you to do that, that's where you're going to start. So at the base, at the playable character part of the script, we'll see that we have used default mechanism. Maybe you want to have a different system, but most of the time you'll probably want to keep it to true. We have a way to detect if the object is grounded or not. We can let's go back to the inspector. It's much easier to read. We can decide if we want our object to reset position. Let's see if I can show you how it works. The idea is that your object is keeping still on the scene. But if you get pushed, well, I'm just really bad at that. But if you get pushed by a platform, it will move somewhere in the back. I'm really, really bad. And I know I can do that easier on the 2D scene. Let's try that again. So yeah, if your object gets pushed back by a platform like that, and if you've checked the should reset position checkbox, you see that the object goes back where it came from. So you don't you have another chance at surviving, because if of course you get pushed too far and don't fall like me, you'll get killed by the left death line. What else? Yeah, back here. So then we have the reset position speed, and that's the end of the playable character. The rest is specific to the jumper. We have a jump force. We have the number of jumps allowed. Right now it's 2, but it could be 0. It could be maybe 5. Let's put it at 5 and see. Maybe I can go further. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I can't jump anymore. Obviously it makes the game much easier. Yay! Okay, so I can change the number of jumps. You can change the cooldown between jumps. For example, if I put it at 1, I'll have to wait 1 second between each jumps. So it's now impossible to double jump, but yeah, you get the idea. I could put maybe 0.1, and that way I wouldn't be able to see. Now I can double jump, but it's not instant. I have a cooldown between each jump. I can also decide that the jumps are only allowed when grounded, so I basically cannot double jump or cannot jump after falling from a platform. And then there's the jump release speed. And yeah, let's say you want to create a new, completely new character. How would you do that? Well, basically, the flappy one is a good example. No, it's not actually. The dragon is. The dragon extends flappy. So flappy is basically the same thing as the jump. So we have a flap force. That's how far we jump. A cooldown between flaps that is currently 0. Everything is commented. I didn't mention that earlier on, but you shouldn't have any problem understanding what each class does. And if you do, just send me an email and I'll explain and probably improve the documentation. There's also a complete documentation of all classes, by the way. So yeah, what it does is at fixed update, it updates the animator, and if we are not jumping, we change some stuff here. And we have that main action start method that is linked to the one in the input manager. Well, the input manager will call this method, and what it does is it checks that the game is in progress. It makes sure that we are allowed to jump, we are not in cooldown, and if everything is okay, we just give the rigid body interface some velocity, and which in turn takes the player airborne. Then we update the mechanisms. So as you can see, it's really basic. You press the main action button, the object jumps. For the dragon one, I wanted to do a bit more than that. As you can see, if I press play on the backwards dragon level, what I have is basically some sort of Flappy Bird, so that's why I extended it. But when I press play, I have a specific animation. I'm really bad, really bad. But when I press play, I have the dragon throw some flames, and there are also other elements of gameplay. So I didn't modify the Flappy class for that. I created a new one, and I strongly encourage you to do that. So for example, I overrided the awake method, so it still calls initialize, but it also gets the renderer and stuff. The explosion animator, that's something really specific when my character collides with the ground. I also wanted to get the camera. So it's basically, the idea is that you override stuff. You override what you want to change. For example, in fixed update, I do what was done already in Flappy, but in the Flappy class. But I also added a check to see that if my dragon is grounded, that means I've just collided with the ground, I'm gonna instantiate an explosion and kill the character, because while the Flappy character can just run on the ground, my dragon explodes when colliding with the ground. And that's basically how you create your new game. You just extend what's already in the engine, and it's not complicated at all. And plus, you can use the examples that are here. And of course, one of my main goals with this asset is, as I did for the Corgi engine one, and I keep doing, is that I'm gonna create much more stuff for you guys at the same price. So if you've bought the Infinite Runner engine, all the upgrades will be free, as they are for the Corgi engine. And I'm gonna create just new gameplays. But I'm excited, and I can't wait to see what you guys come up with using this set. If you do create a game prototype or an actual game, please send me a video or link so I can have a look at it. I'll be super happy to look at it. That concludes this first and quite long tutorial. I hadn't planned for it to be that long, but hopefully you've been able to understand it all, and you'll be able to create cool games with it. Yeah, see you next time.